Some discoveries don't make sense, like structures carved with no tools or sounds recorded where nothing should exist. Objects found in places they shouldn't be, from times that don't match what we know. These aren't theories. They were discovered, studied, and then quietly left behind. But tonight, we're bringing them back. If strange mysteries pull you in, they say you'll have incredible luck if you like, and subscribe before this video ends. Because what you're about to hear might keep you thinking long after you've fallen asleep. The footprint pressed into stone. In the province of Mpumalanga, South Africa, where rolling hills stretch across the landscape and the ancient rock formations rise quietly from the ground, there is a mark in the stone that has drawn attention not because of its size alone, but because of what it resembles. A footprint, carved into granite. Or at least, that is how it appears. The impression is large, significantly larger than that of a human foot, with a shape that seems familiar at first glance. A heel, an arch, a forward section that suggests toes, all pressed into a surface that is otherwise solid and unyielding. And that is what creates the initial reaction. Because granite is not soft, it does not easily take impressions. It forms under conditions of heat and pressure, solidifying into a material that resists change, holding its structure over vast periods of time. And yet, here, there is a shape that looks as though something once pressed into it, and that raises the question, how? Because if the impression is natural, then the resemblance must be coincidental, the result of erosion shaping the rock in a way that aligns with a familiar form. And that is possible, because natural processes can create patterns that resemble recognizable shapes, especially when viewed from certain angles or under specific conditions. But the clarity of the form is what makes it stand out, because it does not appear random. It appears structured, defined. And that creates uncertainty, because the human mind is drawn to patterns. It looks for familiarity. And when something resembles a known shape, the tendency is to interpret it as intentional. And that is where the idea of the footprint becomes more than observation. It becomes interpretation. Some have suggested that the impression represents something beyond natural formation, proposing explanations that extend into ideas that are not supported by established geological understanding. And those interpretations often gain attention, because they offer a narrative that aligns with the visual impact of the site. A large footprint in solid rock, suggesting something unusual. But when examined through the lens of geology, the formation can be understood differently. Granite, while hard, is subject to weathering over time, especially through processes that involve temperature, variation, water interaction, and chemical breakdown, which can gradually shape the surface, creating depressions and patterns. And in some cases, those patterns can resemble familiar forms, not because they were created intentionally, but because the processes that shape them follow natural rules that can produce structured results. And that explanation brings the site back into a framework that is consistent with known processes. But it does not remove the visual impact, because the resemblance remains. The shape is still there. And that shape continues to draw attention, because it exists at the intersection of observation and interpretation. What we see, and what we think it means. And that distinction is important, because it highlights how perception works. How easily a form can be assigned meaning based on resemblance rather than origin, and how that meaning can persist even when alternative explanations are presented. The location itself adds to the experience. Set within a landscape that feels ancient, quiet, and relatively unchanged, the rock formation sits as part of a broader environment that already carries a sense of time, making the presence of the footprint feel connected to something larger. And that connection enhances the perception, because context shapes interpretation. And in a place where the land itself appears old, where the rock formations suggest long periods of formation and change, the idea of something unusual embedded within it becomes more compelling. But the key remains in understanding the difference between appearance and origin, Because not everything that looks intentional was created with intention, and not everything that appears unusual exists outside of explanation, and maybe that is what makes this site stand out. Because it is not only about the footprint itself, it is about how we interpret what we see, how we assign meaning to patterns, and how those meanings can shift depending on perspective. The footprint in granite in that sense becomes less about proving something beyond known processes and more about illustrating how perception interacts with reality, creating interpretations that can vary even when the physical evidence remains the same. And even now, standing near the formation, looking at the shape pressed into the rock, the impression is still clear, still recognizable, still drawing attention. Not because it provides a definitive answer, but because it presents a form that it invites questions. And those questions continue to exist alongside it, shaped not only by the rock itself, but by the way we see it, the sword that shouldn't exist. In the early medieval period, when Europe was shaped by scattered kingdoms, shifting borders, and constant conflict, weapons were not only tools of survival, but reflections of the technology and skill available at the time. And within that world, there exists a type of sword that does not seem to fully belong to its era. This is the Ulfberht sword. At first glance, it appears similar to other swords of the Viking Age, a double-edged blade, balanced for combat, designed for both cutting and thrusting, fitting within the expectations of weapons used between the 9th and 11th centuries. But the difference is not in the shape, it is in the material. Because when these swords are examined more closely, the quality of the metal stands out immediately, showing a level of purity and consistency that is difficult to reconcile with the technology commonly associated with that time. Most swords from this period were made using iron that contained impurities, produced through methods that could not fully remove slag, resulting in blades that, while functional, often lacked uniform strength and flexibility. But the Ulfberht swords are different. Their steel is significantly cleaner, more refined, with a carbon content that allows the blade to achieve both strength and resilience, reducing the risk of breaking under stress while maintaining sharpness. And that level of refinement raises a question. How was this achieved? Because producing steel of that quality requires control over temperature and materials that goes beyond what is typically associated with early medieval European metallurgy. The name itself, inlaid into many of these blades as plus Ulfberhti plus, suggests a maker, or possibly a group, marking the weapon as part of a specific production, and that marking is consistent, repeated across multiple discoveries, indicating that this was not an isolated creation, but part of a broader system, and yet that system is not fully understood. Because while the swords have been found across different regions, their origin points toward areas along the Rhine, suggesting a connection to trade routes, movement of materials, and access to resources that were not evenly distributed. And that introduces another layer, because the quality of the steel may not have come solely from local production. Some theories suggest that the raw material could have originated from regions farther east, possibly through trade networks that connected Europe to areas where higher quality steel production methods were already in use. And if that is the case, then the Ulfberht swords become more than weapons. They become evidence of connection, of movement, of knowledge transferring across distances. But even with that possibility, the consistency of the blade still stands out, because maintaining that level of quality requires more than access to materials. It requires skill, process, control, and that suggests that whoever produced these swords understood metallurgy in a way that was not widespread at the time. And that understanding is visible in the structure of the blade itself, the balance, the strength, the durability. All of it reflects a level of craftsmanship that goes beyond basic functionality. And that raises another question: why are there not more examples like this? Because if the method existed, if the knowledge was available, why does it not appear more widely across other weapons of the same period? And that scarcity adds to the mystery, because it suggests that whatever process was used, it was limited, not broadly shared, possibly controlled, or perhaps lost. And over time, as production methods changed and new technologies developed, the specific qualities that define these swords did not continue in the same form, leaving the Ulfbert blades as something that appears briefly in history, then fades. And that brief appearance is what makes them stand out, because they represent a level of advancement that seems out of place. Not impossible, but unexpected within the timeline in which they exist. And even now, when these swords are studied using modern techniques, their composition still reflects that difference, confirming that they were not ordinary for their time. And maybe that is what makes the Ulfbert sword so compelling, because it is not surrounded by myth, it is real, a physical object, measured, tested, and still holding a question, not about whether it exists, but about how it was made, and why that level of craftsmanship appears, then disappears, leaving behind a small number of blades that continue to suggest that the past may have been more complex than we often assume. The object found inside stone. In the deserts of California, where dry hills stretch across the landscape and the ground holds layers of geological history formed over thousands of years, there was a discovery that at first seemed ordinary. A rock, collected, broken open. But inside it, something appeared that did not belong. This is what became known as the Coso artifact. The discovery was made in the 1960s, when a group of individuals searching for geodes, stones that often contain crystalline formations within them, came across a nodule that looked no different from others found in the area. From the outside, it gave no indication of anything unusual. But when it was cut open, the interior revealed a structure that did not resemble a natural formation. Instead of crystals, there was an object embedded within the stone, and that object appeared manufactured. At the center, there was a cylindrical form surrounded by material that resembled ceramic, and within that, a metal core that suggested the presence of a component rather than a random inclusion. And that immediately raised questions, because the outer layer of the rock appeared to have formed around the object, creating the impression that whatever was inside had been there long enough for mineral deposits to build over it, and that implication is what made the discovery unusual. Because if the rock had formed naturally over an extended period of time, then the object inside it would need to predate that formation, and that challenges expectations, because the object itself resembles something much more recent. Some have compared it to a spark plug, a component used in internal combustion engines, designed to generate a spark that ignites fuel. And that comparison is not without reason. The shape, the materials, the structure, all suggest a level of manufacturing that aligns more closely with modern industrial design than with ancient production methods, and that creates a contradiction. Because the object appears modern, but its context suggests age. And that conflict is what brought attention to the artifact, because it sits between two possibilities. Either the geological assumptions about the surrounding material are incorrect, or the object itself has a history that does not fit within conventional timelines. And both possibilities require examination. Further analysis of the object has suggested that it may indeed be similar to a spark plug, possibly from early 20th century machinery, which would place it within a time frame that aligns with known manufacturing techniques. And if that is the case, then the surrounding material may not be as old as initially assumed, because mineral buildup can occur more quickly under certain conditions, forming hardened layers that resemble older geological formations without actually requiring thousands of years. And that explanation offers a resolution, but not a complete one, because the initial impression remains an object that looks manufactured, encased in something that appears natural, creating a visual and conceptual contrast that is difficult to ignore. And that contrast is what continues to define the artifact, not necessarily as evidence of something impossible, but as an example of how interpretation can shift depending on perspective, because what we see is influenced by context. And when that context is unclear, the meaning becomes open. The Koso artifact, in that sense, is less about a definitive conclusion and more about the process of understanding, how an object can move from being ordinary to mysterious based on how it is presented, examined, and interpreted. And that process is important, because it shows how easily assumptions can form, how quickly conclusions can be drawn, and how necessary it is to look deeper before assigning meaning. And maybe that is what makes this artifact stand out, not because it proves something beyond explanation, but because it exists at the boundary between what appears unusual and what can be understood, reminding us that not all mysteries are solved by finding something unknown. Sometimes they are resolved by understanding what is already there. And even now, the image of that object inside the stone remains. A simple discovery, a complex question, and a reminder that the line between mystery and explanation is not always as clear as it first appears. The tomb of the pharaoh's high priest, along the western bank of the Nile, where the desert begins to rise beyond the fertile edge of the river and the land shifts from green to stone, there are burial sites carved into the ground that were designed not only to preserve the dead, but to reflect status, power, and belief. Among them are the tombs of those who stood close to the pharaoh. Not kings themselves, but something different. High priests. These individuals held positions that connected the physical world to the spiritual, overseeing rituals, temples, and systems of belief that shaped how ancient Egypt understood life, death, and what existed beyond it. And because of that role, their tombs were not simple. They were deliberate, constructed with care, placed within the landscape in ways that reflected both status and function, often located near major centers of religious activity such as Saqqara or Thebes, where temples and ceremonial spaces defined the surrounding area. The structure of these tombs follows a pattern that reveals intention, an entrance that leads inward, a passage that guides movement, chambers that expand as you go deeper. And that progression is important, because it creates a transition, from outside to inside, from light to shadow, from the world of the living to a space designed for something else. The walls within these tombs are not left empty. They are covered with carvings, with inscriptions, with scenes that depict rituals, offerings, and interactions between the priest and the divine. And these are not random decorations. They are structured, each image placed with purpose, forming a visual system that reflects belief, status, and continuity, ensuring that what is represented continues beyond the moment it was created. Because in ancient Egyptian understanding, representation carried power. To depict something was to sustain it, to preserve it, and that is why the tomb becomes more than a resting place. It becomes a system, designed to maintain identity, to support transition, to ensure that the individual continues to exist within a defined framework beyond death. The burial chambers themselves are positioned deeper within the structure, often hidden or sealed, containing the sarcophagus along with objects placed carefully around it, items that were meant to serve a purpose beyond the physical. And those items are selected, not randomly, but according to what was believed to be needed. Tools, amulets, offerings, each one contributing to a larger idea. That death was not an end, but a continuation, and that continuation required preparation. The construction of the tomb reflects that preparation, because building such a structure requires planning, labor, and resources, indicating that the individual buried within it held a position of influence, one that justified the effort required to create something that would last beyond their lifetime. And that effort is visible in the details, the precision of the carvings, the alignment of the chambers, the consistency of the design. All of it suggests control, not only over materials, but over meaning, because every element contributes to a system that is meant to function beyond the immediate moment. And then there is the passage of time, because these tombs, once sealed, remained untouched for long periods, preserving their contents in a way that allows them to be studied today, revealing not only the structure itself, but the ideas embedded within it. And those ideas are consistent across different tombs, across different periods, showing that this was not isolated. It was part of a broader system, a way of understanding existence that shaped how people lived, how they built, and how they prepared for what they believed would come next. And maybe that is what makes the tomb of a high priest stand out, because it represents a position that exists between worlds, not ruling, but interpreting, not commanding, but connecting. And that role is reflected in the structure that holds them, a place designed not only to contain, but to continue, to preserve identity in a way that extends beyond the physical, using architecture, symbolism, and material to create something that remains long after the individual is gone. And even now, walking through these tombs, moving along the carved walls and into the deeper chambers, the structure still holds that intention. Not fully understood in every detail, but clearly deliberate, and still carrying the outline of a system that was built to connect the visible world with something beyond it. The ziggurat, rising from the plain. In the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where some of the earliest cities in human history began to take shape, there are structures that were built not only for function, but for meaning, rising above the flat landscape in forms that could be seen from a distance. Among them are the ziggurats, and near the region of modern-day Baghdad, the remains of such structures still suggest the presence of something that once dominated the horizon. A ziggurat is not a pyramid in the traditional sense. It is stepped, layered, built in ascending platforms that rise one above the other, creating a structure that moves upward in stages rather than forming a single continuous slope. And that design is intentional, because each level represents progression, a movement from the ground towards something elevated, not only physically, but symbolically. These structures were built by ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, including the Sumerians, Akkadians, and later the Babylonians, societies that developed some of the earliest forms of urban life, writing, and organized governance. And within those societies, the ziggurat served as a central point, not for habitation, but for connection between people and what they believed existed beyond the visible world. At the top of the structure, there would often be a temple, a space reserved for rituals, offerings, and interaction with the divine, positioned at a height that separated it from the activity below. And that separation matters, because it creates distinction. The ground is for daily life, the upper levels are for something else, and that division is built directly into the architecture. The construction of a ziggurat required significant effort. Large quantities of mud brick formed the core, shaped and stacked to create the massive base, while outer layers were often reinforced or finished to provide stability and durability. And that process was not simple. It required planning, coordination, a system capable of organizing labor over extended periods. And that system reflects the societies that built them, because structures of this scale do not emerge without structure behind them. And that structure is visible in the precision of the design. The alignment, the symmetry, the way each level supports the next, all of it contributes to a form that is both stable and intentional. And then there is the environment, because the Mesopotamian landscape is largely flat, open, and that makes elevation significant. A structure that rises above that flatness becomes a focal point, something that can be seen from a distance, something that defines its surroundings. And that visibility is part of its function, because it marks a place, a center, a point of reference, and that reference is not only physical, it is cultural, symbolic, connected to the identity of the city itself. Over time, however, many of these structures did not survive in their original form. Built primarily from mud brick, they were vulnerable to erosion, weather, and the passage of centuries, gradually losing their outer layers, their height, their definition. And what remains today is often a reduced version of what once stood, a foundation, a partial structure. But even in that state, the form is still visible, The stepped design, the rising levels, the outline of something that once dominated the landscape. And that outline is enough to understand the intention behind it. Because even without its full height, the structure still suggests upward movement, still reflects the idea of elevation, still holds the pattern that defines its purpose. And maybe that is what makes the ziggurat stand out. Because it represents one of the earliest examples of architecture used not only to build space, but to express an idea, to create a connection between the ground and something beyond it. And that idea is embedded in its form, not written, not spoken, but built, layer by layer. And even now, looking at the remains near the regions that once formed the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, the structure still holds that meaning. Not complete, but clear enough to show that this was not simply a building. It was a system designed to rise above the ordinary and to define a relationship between people, place, and something they believed existed beyond both, the object no one could explain. Across the territories once held by the Roman Empire, from Britain to Central Europe, small metal objects have been discovered that do not fit easily into any known category of tools, weapons, or decorative items. They are consistent in form, recognizable, and yet their purpose remains uncertain. This is the Roman dodecahedron. Each one is made of metal, usually bronze, and shaped into a hollow geometric form composed of 12 flat faces, with each face containing a circular hole of varying size and small knobs positioned at each corner where the edges meet. And that design is precise, not decorative in a random sense, but structured, balanced, consistent across different examples found in different regions. And that consistency suggests intention, because objects that are repeated with the same form are usually created for a purpose. But in this case, that purpose is not clearly known. The dodecahedrons vary in size, but the proportions remain similar. And the placement of the holes appears deliberate, with each opening differing slightly, creating a pattern that invites interpretation, but does not immediately explain itself. And that is where the uncertainty begins. Because when an object is found repeatedly, across distance and time, but without written explanation or clear context, it exists in a space between identification and speculation. And the Roman dodecahedron exists firmly in that space. Some theories suggest that it may have been used as a measuring device, possibly for determining distances or angles, using the different size holes to align with objects at varying ranges. And that idea aligns with the Roman interest in engineering and precision, but there is no direct evidence to confirm it. Others have proposed that it may have had a connection to textile work, perhaps used in the creation of gloves or other woven items, with the holes guiding thread in a structured way. And again, the form could support such a function, but no definitive proof exists. There are also suggestions that it may have been used for ritual or symbolic purposes, possibly connected to belief systems that are not fully documented, where the shape itself carried meaning beyond practical use. And that possibility cannot be dismissed, because objects in ancient societies often served roles that combined function and symbolism. But without written records or clear associations, the interpretation remains open. What makes the dodecahedron particularly interesting is that it does not appear in Roman texts, at least not in any surviving records that describe its use directly. And that absence is unusual, because Roman culture was known for documentation, for recording tools, systems, and practices, and yet this object appears without explanation. And that creates a gap, because the physical evidence exists, but the contextual explanation does not, and that gap is where the mystery forms. The craftsmanship of the objects also reflects skill. The metal is shaped with care. The edges are defined. The holes are placed with precision, and that suggests that the object was not improvised. It was designed, produced intentionally, and likely used in a way that was understood by those who created it. But that understanding did not carry forward, at least not in a form that survives today. And that raises a broader question. How many objects from the past existed with clear purpose at the time, but have lost that meaning as the context around them disappeared? Because meaning is not always embedded in the object itself. Sometimes it exists in how the object is used. And when that use is no longer practiced, the object becomes difficult to interpret. The Roman dodecahedron, in that sense, becomes an example of how knowledge can exist, function, and then fade, leaving behind a form without explanation. And that does not make it impossible. It makes it incomplete, because the object itself is not hidden. It has been found, studied, measured, and yet it remains open to interpretation. And maybe that is what makes it stand out, because it challenges the assumption that all objects from well-documented societies can be fully explained. It shows that even within structured systems, there are elements that do not carry forward in a way that allows them to be easily understood later. And that creates a different kind of mystery. Not one based on absence, but on presence without explanation. And even now, when one of these objects is held, examined, and observed, the form is clear, the design is visible, the structure is defined, but the purpose remains just beyond reach. Not entirely unknown, but not fully resolved, and still holding a question that continues to exist alongside it. The perfect spheres in the forest. In the dense regions of southern Costa Rica, where tropical vegetation grows thick and the land shifts between jungle, river, and open clearings, there are objects that do not immediately reveal how they came to exist, yet stand out with a form that feels almost too precise for their surroundings. These are the Costa Rica stone spheres. At first glance, they appear simple. Large stones, rounded, placed on the ground. But the simplicity is deceptive, because these are not irregular rocks shaped by erosion. They are nearly perfect spheres, carved. And that distinction changes everything, because achieving that level of symmetry in stone requires control, not only over the material, but over the process used to shape it. The spheres vary in size, from smaller examples that can be carried to massive forms that measure over 2 meters in diameter and weigh several tons, each one maintaining a level of roundness that suggests deliberate shaping rather than natural formation. And that shaping raises the first question: how were they made? Because the stone used, often a type of granodiorite, is hard, dense, and not easily formed into smooth shapes without tools capable of removing material with consistency. And while techniques such as pecking, grinding, and polishing are known to have been used in ancient stonework, applying those methods to create a sphere of this size with such precision requires time, effort, and a clear understanding of the final form. And that understanding is visible, because the spheres are not approximate. They are intentional, their surfaces smoothed, their curves consistent. And that consistency suggests a process that was repeated, refined, and understood. But the method itself is not fully documented, because no written records from the culture that produced them have survived to explain how or why they were created. And that absence creates space for interpretation, for speculation, for attempts to understand something that is visible but not fully explained. The spheres are associated with the dodecahedron culture, which existed in this region before the arrival of Europeans, a society that developed systems of settlement, agriculture, and craftsmanship that reflect organization and skill. And within that context, the spheres are not isolated. They appear in groups, arranged in patterns, sometimes aligned, sometimes positioned in ways that suggest intentional placement rather than random distribution. And that placement adds another layer, because now the spheres are not only objects, they are part of a system, a landscape that has been shaped, not only through construction, but through positioning. Some spheres have been found in lines, others in clusters, suggesting that their arrangement may have carried meaning, possibly related to status, territory, or symbolic representation. And that possibility expands their significance, because now they are not only examples of craftsmanship, they are markers, elements within a larger design, and that design is not fully preserved. because over time many of the spheres were moved from their original locations, displaced during agricultural development, or collected as curiosities, breaking the patterns that once defined their placement. And that loss of context makes interpretation more difficult, because the relationship between the spheres may have been as important as the spheres themselves. And without that relationship fully intact, understanding becomes incomplete. The process of creating these spheres likely involved repeated shaping, gradually removing material while checking for symmetry, refining the surface over time until the desired form was achieved. And that process requires patience, consistency, a method that ensures that the shape remains balanced from all sides. And that level of control suggests that the people who created them were not experimenting randomly. They were following a process, one that worked. And that raises another question. Why spheres? Because shaping stone into other forms would have been easier. Flat surfaces, simple shapes. But the sphere is different. It requires equal attention from all directions. It does not rest easily in a stable position. It represents balance, uniformity, and that may have carried meaning, symbolic, conceptual, something that extended beyond function. And then there is the passage of time, because despite environmental exposure, the spheres remain. Their surfaces worn slightly by weather, but their shape still intact, still recognizable, still reflecting the precision with which they were created. And that endurance is important because it shows that the effort invested in shaping them was not temporary. It produced something lasting, something that continues to exist long after the system that created it has changed. And maybe that is what makes the Costa Rica stone spheres stand out, because they are simple in form yet complex in implication, representing a level of craftsmanship that is visible, measurable, and real, while still leaving questions about purpose, process, and meaning. And even now, standing among them, looking at their smooth surfaces and consistent curves, the sense of intention is clear. Not explained, but present. And still holding the outline of something that was created with purpose, shaped through effort, and placed within a landscape in a way that continues to suggest that there is more to understand than what is immediately visible. The spiral aqueducts beneath the desert. In the southern region of Peru, where the landscape stretches into dry valleys and the ground holds little surface water, there is a system built into the earth that does not immediately reveal its function from a distance, yet becomes more defined as you move closer and begin to see the patterns carved into the terrain. These are the Cantiloc aqueducts of Nazca. At first, what stands out are the spiral openings, circular depressions in the ground, descending inward, like paths that lead down into the earth. And these spirals are not isolated. They appear repeatedly across the landscape, connected, part of a larger system, and that system is not visible all at once, because much of it exists below the surface, beneath the dry ground, carrying something that is not immediately seen: water. In a region where water is limited, unpredictable, and essential for survival, the ability to access and control it changes everything, and that is what these aqueducts were designed to do. They are channels constructed underground that tap into natural water sources, guiding the flow through the earth and bringing it to areas where it can be used for agriculture and daily life. But the design is not simple, because building underground channels requires understanding of the terrain, of the water table, of how water moves beneath the surface. And that understanding is reflected in the structure itself. The spirals, known as puquios, serve as access points, allowing maintenance of the channels, providing entry for cleaning and repair, and also helping to regulate airflow within the system. And that airflow matters, because it helps maintain the movement of water, ensures that the channels do not become stagnant, supports the function of the system over time. And that shows something important, because this is not a temporary solution. It is designed for continuity, for long-term use, and that requires planning. The channels extend across distances, linking different points in the landscape, forming a network that connects water sources to areas of need, creating a system that operates quietly beneath the surface. And that quiet operation is part of its design. Because from above, the land appears dry. But below, there is movement. A controlled flow. Guided. Maintained. And that contrast between what is visible and what is hidden defines the aqueducts. Because they are not meant to dominate the landscape. They are meant to work within it. And that approach reflects adaptation. An understanding that instead of forcing the environment to change, it can be worked with, using knowledge of natural systems to create something sustainable. The Nazca people, who developed this system, lived in a region where rainfall was limited, where surface water could not be relied upon, and where survival depended on accessing what lay beneath. And that necessity drove innovation. Because finding water is not enough. It must be controlled, distributed, maintained. And that is what the aqueducts achieve. They take something that is hidden and make it usable, not through visibility, but through structure. And that structure remains, even after centuries. Because the system still functions in some areas, continuing to carry water in the same way it did when it was first built, reflecting a level of durability that is not always associated with ancient engineering. And that durability is not accidental. It is the result of design, of materials placed with care, of channels aligned with the natural flow of water, and of maintenance made possible through the spiral access points that define the system from above. And that brings us back to the question of purpose, because while the basic function is clear, to move water, the complexity of the system suggests that it also carried significance beyond simple necessity. It reflects knowledge, organization, a coordinated effort that required understanding shared across a community. And that community invested in something that would continue to function beyond individual lifetimes. And that continuity is what stands out. Because the aqueducts are not just evidence of survival, they are evidence of planning, of a system designed not only for immediate use, but for sustained operation. And that kind of thinking changes how the structure is understood, because it moves beyond reaction into intention. And maybe that is what makes the Cantalic aqueducts stand out, because they show that even in environments where resources are limited, systems can be developed that not only solve immediate problems, but continue to function over time, reflecting a level of understanding that is both practical and enduring. And even now, standing near those spirals, looking down into the openings that lead beneath the surface, the system is still present, not visible in full, but clearly active, and still carrying the outline of something that was built with knowledge, maintained with care, and designed to last in a place where survival depends on understanding what lies beneath. The people who built above the clouds. In the northern highlands of Peru, where steep mountains rise into mist and the landscape is often covered by dense cloud forest, there are remains of a culture that developed in isolation, high above the valleys below, creating structures that seem positioned not only for survival, but for separation. These are the Chachapoya, often referred to as the Cloud People. What makes this culture unusual is not only where they lived, but how they built within that environment, choosing locations that are difficult to access, placing settlements along ridges, cliffs, and elevated plateaus where the terrain itself becomes a barrier. And that choice changes everything. Because building at altitude requires adaptation, not only to the environment, but to the conditions that come with it. Limited space, difficult access, unpredictable weather, and yet, within these constraints, the Chachapoya developed a system of construction that reflects organization, consistency, and an understanding of how to use the landscape to their advantage. Their settlements are composed of circular stone structures, arranged in patterns that suggest planning rather than random placement, often positioned along narrow ridges where space is limited but visibility is extended. And that visibility is important, because from these elevated positions, the surrounding valleys can be observed, creating a sense of control over the environment below, while maintaining distance from it. And that distance may have been intentional, because isolation can serve as protection, a way of reducing vulnerability. And that is reinforced by the placement of their sites, many of which are located in areas that are difficult to reach even today. Among these locations is Coelap, a massive stone complex built along a ridge, enclosed by high walls that define its boundaries, creating a space that is both elevated and contained. And that combination is significant because it suggests that the site was not only a settlement, but a controlled environment, a place where access was limited and movement was defined. The walls themselves are substantial, rising high above the structures within, forming a barrier that separates the interior from the surrounding landscape, reinforcing the idea that this was a space set apart. And within those walls, the circular houses are arranged closely together, creating a dense environment where space is used efficiently, reflecting a system that is both functional and organized. But the Chachapoya are not only known for their settlements, they are also known for their burial practices. And this is where the landscape becomes even more significant, because instead of placing their dead within the ground or within structures that are easily accessible, they place them in locations that are elevated, remote, and often difficult to reach. Cliffs, cave walls, high ledges, and within these locations, they created sarcophagi and mausoleums that hold human remains, positioned in a way that suggests intention beyond simple burial. And that intention is not fully explained, because placing remains in such inaccessible locations requires effort, planning, and a willingness to work within environments that are not easily navigated. And that raises questions. Why choose such locations? Because burial is not only about placement, it is about meaning. And the placement of these remains suggests that elevation carried significance, that being above the ground, above the landscape, may have been connected to belief systems that are not fully preserved in written form. And that absence of written records is important, because it limits direct understanding, forces interpretation to rely on physical evidence. And that evidence, while clear in form, does not always explain intent. The structures remain. The burials remain. The patterns are visible, but the full meaning is not fully accessible. And that creates a different kind of mystery. Not one based on absence of evidence, but on the limits of interpretation. The Chachapoya culture eventually came into contact with the expanding Inca Empire, and over time, their independence diminished as they were incorporated into a larger system. And with that change, aspects of their culture were altered, absorbed, or lost, leaving behind structures that continue to exist without the full context that once defined them. And that loss of context is what makes their remains stand out, because what we see is only part of the system. The physical, the visible, while the ideas, beliefs, and practices that gave those structures meaning are only partially understood. And maybe that is what makes the Chachapoya stand out, because they represent a culture that built in a way that reflects both adaptation and intention, using elevation not only as a practical advantage, but as a defining feature of how they lived and how they understood their place within the environment. And even now, standing near these sites, looking at the structures rising from the mist-covered ridges and the burial sites placed high above the ground, the sense of separation is still present, not only in space, but in understanding. Because what remains is clear, but what it meant is still only partially known, and still holding the outline of something that existed above the clouds, and beyond complete explanation. The stones that move on their own. The first thing you notice isn't the stones, but the trails they leave behind. Long, uninterrupted lines stretching across the surface of the dry lakebed, cutting through the cracked earth in ways that immediately feel out of place, as if something has passed through here slowly, deliberately, and without interruption. Long lines. Some of them run straight for meters without deviation, while others curve gently before shifting direction in a way that feels almost intentional, creating patterns that don't look random even though nothing about this place suggests control or design. And at the end of each one, there's a stone. Still, exactly where it shouldn't be, because those trails weren't carved into the ground by tools or dragged by anything visible, and there are no signs of disturbance around them that would suggest human involvement or animal movement across the surface. They were left behind, which means the stones moved. And that's where everything begins to break, because movement without observation creates a problem that doesn't resolve easily, especially in a place like Racetrack Playa, where the environment appears completely still for most of the year, giving no indication that anything here is capable of motion at all. Nothing moves, no water, no life, just silence. But that silence isn't empty, because the ground is holding evidence of something that already happened. For decades, people came here trying to understand it, documenting the stones, mapping their positions, returning after weeks or months only to find that some had shifted, others had rotated, and a few had traveled distances that couldn't be explained by simple environmental changes. Some barely moved. Others traveled far, and none of it followed a consistent pattern, which made it worse, because inconsistency removes predictability. And without predictability, the system becomes harder to define, forcing attention away from simple explanations and toward something more complex. At first, wind seemed like the answer. It had to be. The landscape is open, flat, unobstructed, but the stones are heavy, too heavy, and the ground when dry holds them in place with enough resistance that even strong winds fail to produce any visible movement under normal conditions. So the question remained, how do they move, and why only sometimes? Because not every stone leaves a trail. Some remain untouched, others move repeatedly, and that selective behavior suggests that something more specific is happening beneath the surface, something that isn't immediately visible unless the conditions change. And they do, rarely. But when they do, the entire system shifts. After rainfall, a thin layer of water spreads across the playa, just enough to cover the cracked surface without turning it into a deep body, creating a temporary state where the ground is no longer rigid but not entirely fluid either. A thin layer, almost invisible, but enough. Because that small change reduces friction across the surface, allowing objects that would normally remain fixed to become slightly more responsive to external forces. And then the temperature drops. The water freezes, not into thick, solid ice, but into wide, fragile sheets that stretch across the playa, forming a layer that sits just above the softened ground, creating a boundary between the stones and the surface beneath them. Thin ice, wide panels, barely stable. And when the sun rises again, those sheets begin to break apart, not all at once, but gradually, forming large floating sections that shift independently as the environment begins to warm. They move slowly, almost silently. And that's when the wind becomes relevant again, not as a primary force, but as part of a system. Because now, instead of pushing against the stones directly, the wind moves the ice, and the ice distributes that force across a larger area, making it possible to apply consistent pressure over time. And that pressure is enough. The stones begin to slide, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, moving across the softened surface beneath the ice, leaving behind trails that record every shift, every adjustment, every change in direction as the system continues to operate. And that movement is so slow that it almost disappears in real time. You wouldn't notice it. Not unless you were watching continuously. And even then, it might feel like nothing is happening until it's already done. And the trail is already there. And that's why the mystery lasted so long. Because the cause and the effect are separated by time. And without witnessing the cause directly, the effect appears disconnected, leading to interpretations that extend beyond the actual system. But even with this explanation, something remains, because not all movement follows the same logic. Some stones travel in straight paths, others curve. Some even change direction mid-trail in ways that don't fully align with the wind patterns recorded in the area, and that introduces something else. not contradiction, but complexity. Because natural systems don't always produce uniform results, especially when multiple variables are involved, interacting in ways that are difficult to predict or replicate consistently. Water, ice, wind, surface, each one changing slightly with every occurrence, each one influencing the result, and together they create a system that feels unpredictable even when it's understood, and maybe that's where the real fascination lies. Not in the idea that the stones move, but in how they move, quietly, slowly, without witnesses. Because everything here happens under conditions that don't last, in moments that aren't observed, leaving behind only the evidence of something that has already passed. And even now, standing on that empty lake bed, nothing appears to be happening. The stones are still. The air is quiet, the ground looks unchanged, but the trails remain. And those trails tell a story that doesn't rely on speculation, but still feels strange, because it exists in that space between observation and understanding. A system that works, but only when everything aligns, and only when no one is there to see it. The caves that shouldn't exist. The moment you step inside, the first thing that doesn't make sense isn't the size, or the depth, or even the silence that fills the space almost immediately after you enter. It's the walls. They are covered in marks. Not random. Not natural. Every surface, from the floor to the ceiling, is carved with the same repeating pattern, fine parallel dot, etched into the stone at a consistent angle, as if the entire chamber was shaped deliberately, layer by layer, by something that followed the same motion over and over again. And it doesn't stop. Every wall, every column, every corner, the same pattern, which means this wasn't erosion, this was done. And that's where the problem begins. Because the Longu caves aren't small. They are massive underground chambers, carved directly into solid rock, with ceilings rising high above and pillars left in place to support the structure, creating spaces that feel more like constructed halls than natural formations. Entire rooms connected, structured, and all of it carved out from stone. What makes it harder to understand is not just the scale, but the precision. Because the walls are smooth, the angles are controlled, and the pillars are positioned in ways that suggest planning rather than random excavation, as if whoever created this wasn't just removing rock, but shaping space, deliberately, carefully, consistently. And yet, for something this large, this detailed, this labor-intensive, there is no record, no mention, no documentation in historical texts that clearly describes their construction, their purpose, or even their existence at the time they were made. And that absence is unusual, because structures of this scale don't just appear without leaving a trace in written history, especially in a region where documentation has existed for thousands of years. Which raises the first real question: who built them? And more importantly, why? Because carving a single chamber like this would require enormous effort, removing thousands of cubic meters of rock, transporting that material out, shaping the interior, maintaining structural stability, and repeating the process multiple times across interconnected spaces. Not once, but over and over, across multiple caves, each one following a similar design. And that level of repetition suggests a system, not an accident, not a one-time effort, but a coordinated project. Something planned, something organized. And that implies manpower, a lot of it, workers, tools, time, and yet nothing explains it. Some estimates suggest that the amount of rock removed from these caves would be in the hundreds of thousands of cubic meters, a scale of excavation that rivals major construction efforts, even by later historical standards. And still, no record, which makes the caves feel disconnected from history itself, as if they exist, but weren't supposed to be remembered. Inside, the structure becomes even more unusual. The ceilings are angled, not flat, sloping upward in a way that reduces pressure and distributes weight, showing an understanding of structural engineering that suggests knowledge rather than experimentation. And the pillars, they aren't placed randomly. They are positioned with spacing that supports the roof evenly, creating balance across the chamber, preventing collapse while maintaining open space. Which means whoever built this understood load distribution, stability, design. And that changes everything. Because now it's not just about carving rock, it's about engineering, intentional construction, a system built to last. But for what purpose? That's where the theories begin. Some suggest the caves were used as quarries, places where stone was extracted for construction elsewhere. But that doesn't fully fit, because quarrying doesn't require this level of precision. It doesn't require patterned walls, it doesn't require uniform chambers, and it certainly doesn't require leaving behind pillars in symmetrical positions. Others believe the caves may have served as storage spaces, or shelters. But again, the scale doesn't match. These aren't simple cavities. They are structured environments, designed, and that suggests purpose beyond utility. Something more controlled. Something more intentional. There's also the question of the markings. Those repeating lines across every surface, because they aren't decorative. They don't form images, they don't tell stories, they exist as texture, consistent, unbroken, across everything. And that raises another question. Why maintain that pattern everywhere? Because doing so requires effort, time, consistency. And that means it mattered. But how? Was it functional? Did it help with stability, water control, or was it symbolic? Something that held, meaning that no longer survives? And that's where the caves move from engineering into mystery, because the physical structure is clear, visible, measurable. But the intention behind it is not. Even the discovery adds another layer, because the caves weren't known in modern times until relatively recently, when local residents began draining water-filled pits, revealing the chambers beneath. Hidden, submerged, forgotten, until they weren't. And when they were uncovered, the scale became undeniable. Multiple caves, large, connected, all sharing the same characteristics, as if they were part of something larger, something coordinated. And maybe that's the most unsettling part, because nothing about this feels random. Everything feels planned, and yet the plan itself is missing. No clear origin, no clear purpose, just the result, carved into stone and left behind. And even now, standing inside one of these chambers, looking at the walls, covered in those endless parallel marks, the silence feels different. Not empty, but contained. As if the space was built to hold something. Not just physically, but structurally. And maybe that's what makes the Longu caves stand out. Because they don't just exist as a structure. They exist as a question. A complete system. Without a complete explanation. The Longu caves. When the water was drained, something appeared. At first it didn't make sense. Just walls. Too straight, too clean. This wasn't natural. It couldn't be. And then they realized something bigger. This wasn't a cave, it was carved. Not partially. Not roughly. Completely carved into solid rock, forming large underground chambers that felt more like constructed spaces than natural formations. With smooth walls, angled ceilings, and pillars that appeared to have been left behind on purpose rather than by accident. And it wasn't just one. There were many. Multiple chambers, each similar in structure, each connected in ways that suggested planning, creating a network beneath the ground that felt too organized to be random and too large to ignore. The deeper they explored, the stranger it became. Because every surface looked the same, covered in lines. Small parallel marks cut into the stone, all in the same direction, repeated again and again across walls, ceilings, and pillars, as if whoever made this followed a single method and never changed it. Which means one thing. This was intentional. Because natural caves don't repeat patterns like this, and erosion doesn't create uniform markings across entire chambers with this level of consistency. And that leads to the real question. Who made it? Because this kind of work isn't simple. Each chamber is massive, requiring large amounts of rock to be removed, shaped, and cleared out. A process that would take years, possibly decades, and a group of people working together with a clear goal. Not just an effort, planning. Because carving something like this means knowing what you're building before you finish it, understanding how much rock to remove, where to leave support, and how to keep the entire structure stable. And that kind of thinking doesn't happen randomly. It requires knowledge, skill, and coordination. But here's where it gets harder to understand. There's no clear record, no detailed history that explains when these caves were built, who built them, or why they even exist, even though something this large should have been written down somewhere. But it wasn't. And that absence matters, because it leaves the structure without context, even though the physical evidence is right there in front of us. So people started looking for answers. Some said it was a quarry, a place where stone was taken out for construction. And that makes sense at first, but then the details don't match, because quarrying doesn't require smooth walls, it doesn't require repeating patterns, and it doesn't require leaving pillars in perfect positions across multiple chambers. That's not how extraction works. Others suggested it could have been used for storage or shelter. But again, the design feels too controlled, too specific, as if the space was built for something that needed structure, not just space. And then there are the markings, those lines, because they're everywhere, not decorative, not random, just repeated across every surface. And repeating something like that takes time, a lot of time, which means it mattered. But why? Was it functional? Did it help with construction? Or was it something else entirely? Because we don't see symbols. We don't see writing, just patterns. And that makes it harder to interpret, because patterns without meaning are difficult to explain. And meaning without context is easy to lose. Another question comes up. Where did all the stone go? Because these caves are empty, which means everything that was carved out had to be moved somewhere else. And that's not a small amount. It's massive. Thousands of tons removed, transported, gone, and yet there's no clear evidence showing where it ended up. Which adds another layer, because now it's not just about building the caves, it's about what happened after. And that part is missing too. Even the structure itself raises questions. The ceilings are angled, not flat. And that matters, because angled ceilings distribute weight better, reducing the risk of collapse. Which suggests that whoever built this understood how to keep large underground spaces stable. And the pillars, they're placed carefully, not randomly. Spacing is consistent. Balance is maintained. Which means this wasn't trial and error, this was design. And design means purpose. But the purpose is still unknown. And that's what makes the caves different, because everything about them shows intention, scale, precision, consistency. But none of it explains why it was done. And even now, standing inside one of these chambers, the feeling is different. Not like a natural cave, not rough, not uneven, but controlled. Like the space was shaped for something specific. Something that required structure. And that feeling doesn't go away. Because even when you understand how it might have been built, the reason behind it still stays just out of reach. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not how it was made, but why it was made at all. Because the caves are real. You can walk through them, see them, measure them, but understanding them is something else entirely. And that leaves us with one thing. A massive underground system, built with precision, but left without explanation. The sound no one can escape. You don't hear it at first. Most people don't. But once you do, it's hard to ignore. It's not loud, not sharp, just a low, steady sound, like a distant engine that never turns off or a vibration you feel more than hear, sitting quietly in the background without ever fully disappearing. A hum, constant, unclear, and for some people, it never stops. This is what people in Taos, New Mexico began reporting. Not one person, not a few, dozens. Then hundreds, all describing something similar. a low-frequency hum that seemed to come from nowhere, yet felt present everywhere, especially at night when everything else became quiet. And that's when it becomes noticeable, because silence makes it louder. Not in volume, but in awareness. People described it differently. Some said it sounded like a diesel engine idling far away. Others compared it to electrical noise. A few said it felt like pressure inside the head, not just it heard, felt. And that's what made it strange, because not everyone could hear it. Some people noticed nothing at all, standing in the same place at the same time, hearing nothing, while others couldn't escape it. And that difference made it harder to understand. Because if it was real, why couldn't everyone hear it? And if it wasn't, why were so many people describing the same thing? The reports kept growing. People lost sleep. Some said it followed them indoors. Others said it got worse at night. And a few claimed it never stopped, no matter where they went, which turned it from a curiosity into a problem. Because now it wasn't just about sound. It was about impact. People wanted answers. So investigations began. Scientists came in. Equipment was set up. Sensitive microphones. Frequency detectors. Monitoring devices. Looking for anything. But the results were unclear. In some cases, low-frequency sounds were detected. In others, nothing unusual showed up at all. And that made things more complicated. Because now there were two possibilities. Either the sound was external, or it wasn't. One explanation focused on the environment. Low-frequency noise can travel long distances. Industrial machines, power lines, ventilation systems, even distant traffic, all capable of producing vibrations that move through the air and ground, sometimes below the range of normal hearing, but still noticeable under certain conditions. And that made sense because Taos is surrounded by terrain that can carry sound in unusual ways. Mountains, open land, temperature changes, all affecting how sound moves. But that didn't explain everything, because the hum wasn't constant for everyone. Some heard it, some didn't, even in the same location, which led to another idea, that the source might not be entirely external. Some researchers suggested it could be related to how the human ear works, especially at lower frequencies, where small differences in sensitivity can determine whether someone hears a sound or not, which means the hum could exist, but only certain people can detect it. And that would explain the difference. But then another layer appears, because some people describe the hum even when no measurable sound was found, and that leads to a different possibility: internal perception. The brain interpreting signals in a way that creates the experience of sound even when the external source is weak or unclear. And that doesn't mean it's imaginary, because the experience is real. The sound is real to the person hearing it. The discomfort is real. The lack of sleep, the stress, all of it real, which makes it harder to dismiss, because even if the source is uncertain, the effect is not, and maybe that's why the Taos hum stands out, because it sits between two explanations, external and internal. Something in the environment, or something in perception, or both, working together in a way that isn't fully understood. And even today, reports still exist, not just in Taos, but in other places too. Similar descriptions, same kind of sound, low, constant, unclear, which suggests this isn't isolated, it's a pattern, but not one we fully understand. And that's what makes it stay. Because there's no clear beginning, no clear source, no clear end, just a sound that some people hear and others never will. And if you've never heard it, it's easy to ignore, easy to dismiss. But if you have, it's different. Because once you notice it, it doesn't go away. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Not that it exists, but that it exists quietly, without explanation, and without needing to be heard by everyone to be real. The lights that stay too long. It starts as a light in the distance, small at first, easy to ignore if you're not paying attention, just a faint glow hovering above the valley, as if it belongs to something far away, something ordinary, something you don't need to question. But it doesn't move like something ordinary. It stays, not for a second, not for a moment, but for minutes, sometimes longer. And that's when it becomes something else, because lights in the sky aren't unusual on their own, but lights that remain in place, that hold their position without flickering, without fading, without following a predictable path, start to feel different. They don't behave like aircraft, they don't behave like stars. And they don't disappear when you expect them to. In the Hessdalen Valley in Norway, this has been happening for decades. Lights appearing in the sky without warning, sometimes white, sometimes yellow, sometimes shifting between colors, moving slowly or not moving at all, changing brightness in ways that don't follow a clear pattern. And people noticed. At first it was just reports, locals seeing something unusual, lights hovering over the valley. Then more people saw them, and the description started to match. Glowing spheres, floating, moving without sound, and sometimes accelerating in ways that didn't make sense, not gradual, sudden, as if something invisible was controlling them. And that's where it stops being simple. Because when something repeats, when different people describe the same thing over time, it becomes harder to ignore, especially when those observations happen in the same place, under different conditions, across different years. This wasn't a one-time event. It kept happening again and again, which means something is causing it. But what that something is still unclear. Scientists got involved. Because this wasn't just a story anymore, it was observable, measurable. So they brought equipment, cameras, sensors, radar. And for the first time, the lights were recorded properly, not just seen, but captured, tracked, analyzed, turning something uncertain into something that could be studied. And the results made it more interesting. Because the lights were real. Not illusions, not simple reflections. Actual sources of light. Emitting energy. Visible on instruments. But their behavior didn't fully match known explanations. Some lights hovered. Others moved slowly across the valley. And a few changed direction all suddenly, accelerating in ways that didn't follow typical motion patterns for natural atmospheric phenomena. And that raised new questions. Because if it's natural, why does it behave like that? One explanation focused on the ground itself. The valley contains minerals. Certain combinations of elements that, under the right conditions, could produce electrical activity, especially when pressure builds within the earth, releasing energy in the form of light, which would explain the glow, the presence, the repetition. But it doesn't explain everything, because the movement is still unusual, and the duration doesn't always match. Some lights stay visible for long periods. Others appear and vanish quickly, and that variation makes it harder to define. Another idea suggests plasma. Charged particles forming visible shapes in the air, interacting with electromagnetic fields, creating light that can move, change shape, and persist under certain conditions. And that fits some observations. But again, not all, because the lights don't always behave the same way. And consistency matters. Without it, the explanation stays incomplete. And that's where the mystery remains. Because this isn't something imagined. It's been seen, recorded, studied, and still not fully explained. Even today, the lights appear. Not every night, not on demand, but often enough to be expected. Which means whatever is causing it is still active, still happening, still part of that valley. And maybe that's what makes it different. Because most mysteries fade over time. They disappear. They stop. But this one didn't. It stayed. It continues. And that changes how it feels. Because now it's not just something from the past. It's something ongoing, something that still exists. And if you stand in that valley at night, looking out across the open space, waiting, watching, there's always that possibility that something will appear. A light, small at first, then brighter, then holding its place in the sky longer than it should. And in that moment, it doesn't matter how many theories exist, because what you're seeing is real, and the explanation is still catching up. The sound from the deep, far beneath the surface of the ocean, beyond the reach of light, beyond the depth where most life is ever observed, there are regions that remain largely unknown, not because they are hidden, but because they are difficult to access, difficult to study, and difficult to fully understand. And within those depths, sound travels differently, faster, farther, more clearly, because water carries vibrations in a way that air does not, allowing signals to move across vast distances, sometimes traveling thousands of kilometers without losing their structure. And it is within that environment that something was detected. A sound, not continuous, not repeated, but distinct, powerful, and unlike anything recorded before. This is what became known as the bloop. It was first identified in 1997 by underwater listening devices operated to monitor activity across the oceans, systems designed to detect low-frequency sounds that might indicate geological events, volcanic activity, or other large-scale disturbances beneath the surface. And what they recorded stood out immediately, because the signal was strong, very strong, louder than most known natural ocean sounds. And it had a pattern, a rapid rise in frequency over time, lasting for just over a minute, creating a shape that suggested movement, as if something had produced the sound while changing position or speed. And that raised questions, because the strength of the signal implied size, not small, not localized, but large enough to generate a sound that could be detected across multiple sensors separated by vast distances. And that made it difficult to ignore. At first, the source was unclear. There was no visible event, no direct observation, only the sound itself. And that sound did not immediately match known categories. It wasn't clearly seismic. It didn't align perfectly with known marine life. And it didn't resemble mechanical noise from human activity, which left it open. And when something is open, interpretation follows. Some suggested that it could be biological, that something living in the ocean, something large, had produced the signal, because certain marine animals are known to generate powerful sounds, using them for communication across long distances. And that idea was not unreasonable, because the ocean holds species that are still being discovered, environments that are still being explored, and systems that are not fully mapped. But there was a problem: scale. Because to produce a sound of that magnitude, the source would need to be extremely large, larger than most known marine organisms. And that raises questions about how such a creature could exist without being observed in other ways. And that made the biological explanation uncertain. Other theories pointed toward geological activity. Ice movement within large ice structures. Fracturing. Shifting. Because when ice breaks or moves under pressure, it can produce powerful low-frequency sounds that travel through the ocean over long distances. And that explanation aligns with known processes, because the ocean is not still. It is active, dynamic, constantly changing. And within that activity, large-scale events occur that are not always visible from the surface. Over time, further analysis suggested that the sound may have originated from such an event, specifically related to ice movement in remote regions of the ocean, where large masses shift, crack, and interact with the surrounding water. And that provided an answer, but not a complete one, because while the explanation fits the data, the sound itself still carries something unusual: its structure, its intensity, the way it rises, and that keeps it distinct. Because even when categorized, it doesn't fully lose its impact, and maybe that is what makes the bloop stand out, because it represents a moment where something was detected before it was understood, where the signal came first and the explanation followed later, shaped by analysis, comparison, and interpretation. And that sequence matters because it shows how knowledge develops, not always in a straight line, but through observation, question, and refinement. The ocean, even now, remains one of the least explored environments on the planet, with vast areas still not fully mapped, systems still not fully understood, and processes still being studied. And within that environment, sounds like this can occur. Rare, powerful, and initially unexplained. And even when explanations are proposed, they do not remove the sense of scale, the sense of distance, the sense that something happened far below the surface, beyond direct observation, leaving behind only a signal that traveled outward until it was detected. And that signal is what remains. Recorded, analyzed, and still remembered. Not because it proved something unknown, but because it reminded it, how much of the ocean is still not fully understood, and how something as simple as a sound can carry across that distance, reaching us long after the event itself has passed, leaving behind only a trace of something that happened far below, in a place we rarely see. The stone that was never meant to stay. In the granite quarries of Aswan, where the ground itself has been shaped by extraction over thousands of years, there is a block of stone that was never moved, never raised, and never completed, yet still stands as one of the clearest records of how something immense was almost created. This is the unfinished obelisk. It lies where it was carved, still attached to the bedrock, a massive form outlined in stone, partially separated from the ground, its sides cut, its shape defined, but its base still connected, as if the process was interrupted before it could be completed. And its scale is difficult to ignore. If finished, it would have stood as the largest obelisk ever made, rising over 40 meters in height and weighing more than 1,000 tons. A single piece of stone shaped from granite, intended to be lifted, transported, and placed upright somewhere far from where it now rests, and that intention is visible, because the work is precise. The edges are defined, the surface is smoothed, the form is already there, not imagined, but nearly realized. And that is what makes it different. Because this is not a ruin, it is a process, frozen in place. The quarry itself provides context. This is where ancient Egyptians sourced the stone used for monuments across their civilization, extracting large blocks of granite to create obelisks, statues, and architectural elements that would be transported along the Nile and placed within temples and cities. And the method used to shape these stones is still visible here. Rows of small indentations, marks left by pounding stones, tools made of harder material used to chip away at the granite slowly, gradually removing sections of rock until the desired shape began to emerge. And that process required time, consistency, repetition, because granite is not easy to cut. It resists, it holds its structure, and shaping something this large required not only effort, but control over that effort, ensuring that the stone was carved evenly, that the structure remained intact, and that no fractures developed during the process. And that is where something changed. Because along one side of the obelisk there is a crack, not small, not surface level, but deep enough to compromise the entire structure. And once that crack appeared, the plan could no longer continue, because an obelisk must be a single, unbroken piece. Any structural weakness would make it unstable, unsafe to lift, impossible to use. And so, the work stopped, not gradually, but completely, leaving the obelisk exactly where it was, still attached to the rock, still showing the stages of its creation, but never reaching the final step. And that moment is what remains, a decision, captured in stone. Because instead of removing it, instead of attempting to repair or reshape it, it was left behind, abandoned in place, becoming something that no longer served its original purpose, but instead preserved the process itself. And that preservation is important, because it reveals how these structures were made, not through advanced cutting machines or unknown methods, but through controlled, repetitive work, using tools that applied force gradually, shaping the stone over time rather than removing it in large sections. And yet, even with that understanding, the scale still stands out, because working on something this size requires coordination. Multiple workers, a clear system, an understanding of how to move from carving to transport, because shaping the obelisk is only part of the process. The next step would have been to separate it fully from the bedrock, then move it, then raise it, and each of those steps carries its own complexity, especially the transport, because moving a stone of this size would require more than strength. It would require planning, a route, a method to reduce friction, possibly water transport along the Nile, and that suggests that the process extended far beyond the quarry itself. It was part of a system, one that connected extraction to placement, and that system is visible across Egypt in the monuments that still stand today. But here, in Aswan, we see the part that usually remains hidden. The beginning, the shaping, the moment before movement, and in this case, the moment where it stopped. And maybe that is what makes the unfinished obelisk stand out. Not because it represents something unknown, but because it shows something incomplete. A project that was understood, planned, executed up to a point, and then abandoned. Leaving behind not just a structure, but a record of intention, effort, and limitation, all visible in a single piece of stone that never left the ground from which it was carved. And even now, standing beside it, the scale becomes clearer. The length, the depth of the cuts, the marks left by the tools, all of it showing the work that had already been done, and the work that would have followed, if not for the flaw that changed everything. And that flaw is still there, running through the stone. A reminder that even the most carefully planned structures are still bound by the material they are made from. And sometimes that material decides the outcome. The stones that change over time. In a quiet region of Romania, where the landscape appears ordinary at first glance, there are stones scattered across the ground that don't immediately stand out for their size or shape, but for something else, something that becomes noticeable only when you begin to compare them over time. These are known as trovons. At first, they look like simple rocks, rounded, uneven, placed naturally within the soil. Nothing unusual. But the more they are observed, the more something begins to feel different. Because these stones don't remain exactly the same. Not quickly. Not in a way that can be seen in a single moment, but gradually, over time, they change. Some appear to grow. Not suddenly, but slowly. Increasing in size in a way that suggests that something is happening beneath the surface. Something that is not immediately visible, but leaves a clear result over longer periods. And that idea is what brought attention to them, because stones are not expected to grow. They are expected to remain fixed, unchanging. But here, that expectation doesn't fully hold. After rainfall, something subtle begins to occur. Moisture enters the stone, and within it, there are layers. Mineral structures. Cemented particles that respond to the presence of water, causing pressure to build internally as the material reacts, expands slightly, and forms new outer layers. And that process repeats. Again and again. Each time adding small amounts to the surface. So small that it cannot be seen immediately, but over time, it becomes noticeable. And that's where the idea of growing stones comes from. Not because they are alive, but because they change, gradually, consistently, in response to their environment. And that response is important, because it shows that even something as solid as stone is not entirely static, that under the right conditions, change can occur, not through movement, but through accumulation, layer by layer, surface by surface, and that creates the illusion of growth, which is why some of these stones appear larger over time, not dramatically, but enough to be observed. And that observation leads to interpretation. Some see them as something unusual, something beyond normal geological behavior, because the idea of stones growing challenges expectation. But when examined more closely, the process aligns with known mineral activity. where materials within the stone respond to moisture, pressure, and chemical interaction, gradually altering the structure. And that explanation brings clarity, but not complete familiarity, because even with understanding, the visual effect remains. The stones still appear as if they are changing, still seem different from what we expect, and that difference is enough to make them stand out. There is also the way they are shaped. Some are rounded, others irregular. Some appear almost formed, as if shaped intentionally, but they are not carved. They are formed naturally, through accumulation, through pressure, through time, and that time is what defines them, because the process is slow, extremely slow, measured not in moments, but in years, even decades, which means that the change is not something that happens in front of us. It is something that becomes visible only when compared across time, and that makes it harder to notice, because without that comparison, the stones appear unchanged, still, ordinary, but they are not entirely static. And maybe that is what makes them interesting, because they exist in that space between expectation and reality, where something appears simple, but behaves in a way that suggests something more, even when the explanation is grounded in natural processes. And even now, walking through those areas where the trovants are found, the stones sit quietly in the landscape, unmoving, unchanging in the moment, but still part of a process that continues beyond what we can immediately see. A process that happens slowly, silently, and without drawing attention to itself, leaving behind only small changes over time, changes that remind us that even the most solid things are not entirely fixed, but part of systems that continue to operate long after we stop watching. The circles that refuse to grow, they don't look strange at first, just empty circles in the ground, patches where nothing grows, but the longer you look, the more it starts to feel wrong, because the grass around them is alive, dense, and healthy, yet the moment it reaches the edge of the circle, it stops completely, as if something invisible is holding it back. No fading, no transition, just a clean boundary. And that's what makes them stand out, because in nature things usually blend. They shift gradually, they change slowly, but here the change is immediate, almost controlled. Across the Namibian desert, these circles repeat over and over again, spreading across large distances in patterns that don't look random, forming clusters that seem evenly spaced, as if the land itself is following a hidden rule. From above, it becomes clearer. Hundreds of circles, sometimes thousands, all similar in size, all separated, almost evenly. And that's where the question begins, because patterns like this don't usually happen without a cause, and when they do, that cause tends to leave a trace. But here, the cause isn't obvious. The circles don't move. They don't grow quickly. They don't disappear suddenly. They just exist, then slowly change, over time. Some fade, some shrink, some vanish completely, and new ones appear somewhere else, which means this isn't a fixed pattern. It's active, a system. Something is constantly creating them, and that something is still working. At first, the simplest explanation was water, because in a place where rainfall is rare and the soil holds limited moisture, even small differences in water distribution can decide where plants grow and where they don't. And that makes sense, because the desert is sensitive. Small changes matter, but the shape doesn't fit, because water doesn't usually create perfect circles with sharp edges, and it doesn't maintain them for years without breaking the pattern. So the focus shifted underground to something smaller, termites, hidden beneath the surface, constantly moving through the soil, building networks that change how water flows, how it collects, and how it spreads, creating areas where conditions are different without anything being visible above ground. And that could explain the circles, because if the soil beneath is altered, the surface reacts, plants respond, growth changes, and boundaries form. But even that doesn't fully explain the spacing, because the circles don't just appear randomly. They maintain distance from each other, as if they are competing for something. And that leads to another layer. Plants themselves. Because in harsh environments, plants don't just grow, they compete, spreading roots outward, searching for water, pushing against each other, creating zones where growth becomes limited in certain areas. And over time, that competition can form patterns, stable ones, repeating ones. But again, it's not perfect, because no single explanation fits everything, and that's where the idea changes. Because instead of one cause, there may be several. Water, soil, heat, insects, plant interaction, all working together, each one small on its own, but together, creating something visible, something structured, something that looks designed, even when it isn't. And that's what makes it feel strange, because the human mind looks at patterns and assumes intention. It expects randomness in nature. But when that randomness turns into order, it starts to feel controlled, even if it's not. And these circles feel controlled, too clean, too consistent, too repeated. And that's why they stay interesting, even after years of study, even after explanations are proposed, because the visual effect doesn't go away. You still see them. You still feel like something is off, even if you understand the science behind it. And even now, standing in that desert, surrounded by those empty circles, with nothing but wind and silence stretching across the land, the pattern feels deliberate, not chaotic, organized, as if the ground itself is following a rule that we can see but not fully understand. And maybe that's the part that stays. Not the explanation, but the feeling that something simple is creating something that doesn't look simple at all. And the circles continue, forming, fading, repeating, without stopping, without announcing themselves, just quietly shaping the land over time. The fossil with something inside. The object was never meant to be important. It was found the way many things are found, by accident, during routine geological work, in a place where rocks are broken, examined, and usually dismissed without much attention. At first it looked like any other stone. Solid, unremarkable, part of a formation that had existed for a long time. But when it was opened, something inside didn't match. There was a structure embedded within the rock, not loose, not separate, but fixed inside it, surrounded by material that had clearly formed around it over time. And the moment it was seen, the reaction was immediate. Not because of what it was, but because of what it looked like. It resembled a screw. Not perfectly, not manufactured, but close enough that the comparison came naturally. A spiral form, ridged, structured, something that appeared organized rather than random, and that resemblance changed how the object was understood, because once something looks familiar, it becomes difficult to see it any other way. And that is where the problem begins, because the rock itself is old. Not just old in a general sense, but formed through geological processes that take place over long periods of time, far beyond anything associated with human-made objects. Fossils, by definition, are records of life or natural formation, preserved through mineralization, shaped slowly as layers build, compress, and transform. So if the stone is old, then whatever is inside it must also be old, and that creates a contradiction. Because screws, as we understand them, are modern. They belong to manufacturing, to tools, to systems that require precision and design. They do not belong inside rocks formed through natural geological processes. And yet, the shape is there, which leads to the first instinct, to question the timeline. Some interpretations move quickly from observation to conclusion, suggesting that the object represents something out of place, something that doesn't fit within the accepted understanding of history. The idea that it could be evidence of advanced technology existing far earlier than expected, or something left behind by processes that are not fully understood. And that kind of explanation is compelling, because it aligns with the visual impact of the object. It looks like something made, so the assumption becomes that it must have been made. But that assumption depends on one thing, that the appearance reflects the origin, and that is not always true. Because in geology, structures can form that resemble familiar objects, even when they are entirely natural. Mineral deposits can create repeating patterns. Crystallization can produce shapes that follow consistent lines. Pressure and chemical interaction can form ridges, spirals, and layered structures that appear organized even though they are the result of natural processes. And that is where the explanation shifts. Because instead of asking how a screw ended up inside a fossil, the question becomes whether it is actually a screw at all. The material matters. The composition matters. Because if the object is metallic in a way that matches known manufactured materials, that would support one kind of interpretation. But if it is mineral-based, formed from the same processes that created the surrounding rock, then the resemblance becomes something else entirely. A coincidence. A pattern that looks familiar, but formed naturally. And in many cases, that is what these objects turn out to be. Mineral formations, not inserted, not embedded after the fact, but formed in place over time, layer by layer, which explains how they appear inside the rock. Because they didn't enter it, they became part of it. And that distinction changes everything, because now the object is no longer something that challenges history. It becomes something that reflects how complex natural processes can be, how they can produce shapes that align with human-made designs, not because they were designed that way, but because the underlying patterns follow similar principles. Repetition, structure, growth, and that still leaves something interesting behind, because even when explained, the resemblance doesn't disappear. The object still looks like a screw, still creates that immediate reaction, still makes people pause, and that is where the fascination remains, not in what it proves, but in how it appears, because it sits at the intersection of recognition and reality, where what we see suggests one thing, and what it actually is suggests another. And that gap is where the mystery exists, not as something unsolved, but as something easily misunderstood, because the mind fills in patterns. It looks for familiarity. It connects shapes to meaning. And sometimes that connection leads to conclusions that feel stronger than the evidence itself. And even now, when objects like this are found and shared, the same reaction repeats, the same question, the same uncertainty. Because the image comes first, the explanation comes later. And not everyone accepts it, which means the object continues to exist in two forms, one as a natural formation, the other as something unexplained. And which one it becomes depends on how it is viewed. But the stone itself doesn't change. The structure inside it remains the same, fixed, silent, part of a process that happened long before it was ever discovered. And maybe that is what makes it worth looking at. Not because it proves something extraordinary, but because it shows how easily something ordinary can appear extraordinary when it takes a form we recognize, and how that recognition can shape the way we understand it, even when the explanation is already there. The black sarcophagus of Alexandria. When it was first uncovered, there was nothing about it that felt ordinary. It was buried beneath the ground in Alexandria, hidden below layers of earth that had remained undisturbed for centuries. And when the excavation team reached it, what they found wasn't a collection of fragments or scattered remains. It was intact. A single, massive stone coffin, sealed, unopened. And that alone made it significant. Because most ancient burials are not found like this. They are disturbed, broken, open long before they are rediscovered. But this one was different. It hadn't been touched. The sarcophagus was made of black granite, large, heavy, and precisely shaped, with a lid that sat firmly in place, sealed so tightly that it appeared nothing had entered or left since the moment it was closed. And that raised immediate attention, because a sealed sarcophagus means something rare. It means whatever is inside is still inside. And that leads to the question, who was buried there? Because the size alone suggested importance. This wasn't a simple burial. The stone was too large, too carefully shaped, and that level of effort usually points to someone significant, someone whose burial required protection, permanence, and separation from the outside world, which led to speculation. Some believed it could belong to a high-ranking official. Others suggested something more, even the possibility that it could be linked to a figure of greater historical importance, because sealed tombs always carry that possibility, that sense that something valuable or something rare has been preserved inside, and that curiosity grew. But opening it wasn't simple, because the lid itself weighed several tons, and removing it required careful planning, controlled lifting, and a process that ensured the structure wouldn't be damaged during the attempt. And when the time finally came, the moment changed everything. Because what they expected was not what they found. When the lid was lifted, there was no immediate clarity, no visible figure, no clear structure. Instead, there was liquid, dark, murky, filling the interior of the sarcophagus, and within it, remains. Not preserved in the way people imagined. Not intact, but partially dissolved, submerged in what appeared to be contaminated water that had seeped into the coffin over time, altering what was inside. And that changed the narrative completely. Because instead of a perfectly preserved burial, what remained was something far less defined. Something affected by time, by leakage, by conditions that were not originally part of the burial. 3 individuals were identified within, not 1. 3. And that raised another question. Because sarcophagi of this scale are usually designed for a single individual, not multiple, which means something else happened. Something that changed the original intention. Or perhaps the burial was always meant to hold more than one person. But without clear records, that part remains uncertain. The remains themselves showed signs of damage. Not from the excavation, but from the environment inside the coffin. And one of the skulls showed evidence of injury, suggesting that at least one of the individuals may have experienced trauma before burial. And that adds another layer, because now it's not just about who they were, but how they died, and why they were placed together. But even with all this, the larger mystery was never about what was found inside. It was about what was expected. Because before it was opened, the sarcophagus represented possibility. A sealed space, untouched, holding something unknown. And that unknown created anticipation, speculation, stories. But once opened, the reality was different. Not dramatic, not extraordinary in the way people imagined, but still important, because it showed something real. A burial affected by time, by environment, by factors that changed what was originally placed inside. And that is often how archaeology works. Not every discovery reveals something perfect. Sometimes it reveals something altered, something incomplete, something that has changed over time. And that doesn't reduce its value, it changes how it is understood. Because the sarcophagus still tells a story, even if that story is not fully clear. It tells us that it was sealed, that it remained hidden, that it was opened only recently, and that what was inside was affected by conditions that were not visible from the outside. And maybe that is what makes it stand out. Not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. A moment of discovery. A question waiting to be answered. And the reminder that sometimes what we expect to find is very different from what is actually there. And even now, long after it has been opened, studied, and documented, the black sarcophagus remains a symbol of that moment. The moment before it was opened, when everything inside was still unknown. And that unknown was what made it powerful. The stone that bleeds. At first it looks like any other rock. Rough, weathered, part of the landscape. But then something changes. A mark appears on the surface. Dark red. not painted, not placed, but coming from the stone itself. And that's when people begin to notice it differently, because rocks are not supposed to produce anything. They don't bleed. They don't change in ways that resemble something living. And yet, here, the surface carries a color that feels out of place. The site is quiet, not built, not shaped. Just a natural formation that has become known not because of its size or structure, but because of what appears on it under certain conditions. A red liquid, slow, subtle, emerging from small points on the surface. And once it's seen, it's difficult to ignore, because the resemblance is immediate. It looks like blood. Not exactly the same, but close enough to create that reaction. Close enough to turn something simple into something that feels unusual, and that reaction spreads. Because when something looks familiar, it becomes easier to assign meaning to it, and over time, stories begin to form around it, explanations that connect the appearance to something beyond the physical process itself. Some see it as a sign, something symbolic, something connected to belief. Because throughout history, places like this often become part of local tradition, where natural events are understood through cultural meaning rather than scientific explanation. And that gives the stone a different role. Not just a rock, but something more, a place, a marker, something people return to. But the physical process is still there, and that process matters, because the color does not appear randomly. It follows patterns. It shows up under certain conditions, and that suggests a cause. Within the stone itself, the rock contains minerals, iron, elements that react with moisture and air. And when those elements are exposed, especially after rainfall or changes in temperature, oxidation occurs, creating a reddish substance that seeps through small openings, spreading across the surface in a way that resembles liquid. And that is where the explanation begins. Because iron oxidation produces that color, that tone, that appearance. And when it mixes with water, it can move, slowly, across the surface, creating streaks, marks, lines that look like something flowing. And that flow is what creates the illusion. Because it resembles something we recognize, even though it is not the same. And that distinction is important. Because the stone is not alive. It is reacting, responding to its environment, to moisture, to air, to time. And that reaction produces something visible, something that changes how the stone is perceived. But even with that explanation, the effect remains. Because seeing it is different from understanding it. The color is still there. The movement is still there. And the resemblance does not disappear, which is why the site continues to attract attention. Not because it cannot be explained, but because it does not immediately feel explainable. And that feeling is what gives it presence. Because the human mind connects visuals to meaning. And when something looks like blood, it carries weight even when the cause is natural. And over time, that connection becomes part of the place itself. Stories form, beliefs attach, and the stone becomes more than just material. It becomes something observed with expectation, something people come to see, and what they see depends on how they look at it. Some see a natural reaction, others see something more, and both views exist at the same time, because the physical process does not remove the interpretation. It exists alongside it. And maybe that is what makes this stone stand out. Not because it defies explanation, but because it sits between what we know and what we feel, between the visible cause and the meaning we attach to it. And even now, standing near it, watching the surface as the color appears and slowly spreads, the effect is still the same. It draws attention. It holds it. Because it looks like something it is not. And that is enough to turn a simple rock into something that people remember.